Morning, colleagues. I think we can get started for today, and people can join us as they log on. My name is Baba Tamana Gubule, and I'm a senior economist at TIPS, and I will be moderating the session today. As you are all aware, today's session aims to present work conducted by TIPS, my colleagues Mohammed and Lerato, which looks at specifically policy options for stimulating demand for bioplastics in South Africa. And as we know, South Africa, just by way of brief introduction, heavily relies on coal as an input into chemicals production, and bio-based bioplastics has, as the research advocates for, has room to substitute for traditional plastics. The market, as we know, for bioplastics in South Africa is currently limited, and market demand has really yet to materialize substantially. And while we know that there are currently existing a number of efforts to develop the supply side of the market, there is room for policy options or tools to stimulate demand for sustainable plastics. So really, again, this research that will be presented today focuses on presenting policy options that can stimulate demand for bioplastics in South Africa. And then just quickly and briefly, by way of acknowledgement, the research presented today was made possible by our partners, UNIDO, DEF, PAGE, ILO, UNITA, UN Environment, and UNDP, and we would like to acknowledge them. We have a very simple program for today. We have representatives from our partners, DEF and UNIDO, who will just provide us with a brief introduction before we get into the substantive presentation. And then I will hand over to Mohammed and Lerato, who will deliver the presentation. And I do encourage everyone to please engage with the presentation by putting in your questions in the Q&A box. And we will take the questions once Mohammed and Lerato have completed the presentation. And again, I do encourage everyone to use the Q&A box, but if there are questions that you would like to pose live, I will be taking questions. Just raise your hand using the button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I will hand over to Janita from DEF, who will just give us 5 minutes of an introduction. Following Janita, I will give Oznimi from UNIDO the opportunity to also just 5 minutes of an introduction. And over to you, Janita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Baba, for the brief introduction. Good morning to all who've made the time to join us on this virtual validation workshop. I am Janita Buddle, Senior Policy Advisor for the coordinating the sustainability programs and projects in the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. Over and above that, I'm also coordinating the Partnership for Action on the Green Economy program. So this brings us to a point wherein we started this work a few years ago with the development of the green economy industry and trade analysis activities, which largely focused on 4 priority areas that included the embedded generation technologies, water efficiency related technologies, as well as the uptake of biogas in the transport sector, and finally the biomaterial sector and what the potential for the biomaterial sector in South Africa would be. Well, post this process, we identified the need to hone in on the biomaterial sector, as it held a lot of promise for the medium to long term in terms of access to markets, as well as addressing some of the barriers that the report also alluded to. And over and above that, we went into a second process of putting in place the implementation strategy and the action plans. There were a total of 6 action plans, and from it, we decided that we needed to have this feasibility study undertaken. And today we find ourselves at a time where TIPS is in a position to now present us with their findings, specifically focusing on the demand side application, and uptake of biomaterials, and more specifically looking at the bioplastics industry. So we'd certainly welcome this opportunity to be engaging with you as the stakeholders, and we look forward to the discussions that will ensue. Thank you so much, Baba.
Thank you, Janita. Uznimi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Baba, for giving me the floor. My name is Ozunimi Iti. I'm an industrial development officer working with UNIDO's Department for Environment and coordinating the UNIDO's work under the Partnership for Action on Green Economy. I would like to say a warm good morning and welcome to everyone here. And thank you so much for joining us to show your support to biomaterials development in South Africa. As you may be aware, the UN Industrial Development Organization's mandate is to promote and accelerate inclusive and sustainable industrial development in our member countries like South Africa by helping them to improve the environmental performance, resource productivity, and safety of existing industries, as well as by supporting the creation of new industries that provide environmental goods and services, such as biomaterials. Through the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, UNIDO, in collaboration with UNEP, ILO, UNDP, and UNITA, have been providing a suite of integrated and quite holistic support to South Africa on greener and more inclusive growth strategies. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa's desire to transition to a green economy was declared at the highest political level. And indeed, the way the country has articulated the green economy agenda is evident in its macroeconomic policy framework and the development vision of the country. Trade and investment in environmental goods and services, creation of a resource-efficient, low-carbon, export-oriented industry can strategically position the country to create immense environmental, social, and economic benefit to the South African people. Consequently, UNIDO South Africa on the page developed the action plan and implementation for biomaterials in South Africa in 2018, and where we identified the key barriers, the opportunities, the models to advance the biomaterial space in the country. Capitalizing on this experience and the comparative advantage as a specialized agency of the UN, UNIDO further supported the country through commissioning the analysis of the demand side dynamics of the biomaterial industry in South Africa. And this is what will be presented today. This study considerably enhances knowledge on the sector, maps out trends of biomaterials at global and market levels, global and local markets, and examines the existing and the likely consumers of biomaterials in the country. The optimal policies, best practices, proper design, timely adoption and implementation of policies are an important factor for a sector like biomaterials to grow. We believe that this knowledge product will work as a stepping stone to implementing the government's bioeconomy strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, I would especially like to quickly highlight another project that UNIDO is spearheading in the biomaterial space in South Africa, which supports the transition from conventional plastics to more environmentally sustainable alternatives. This project is outside the scope of PAGE, and we are cooperating with DSI and the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research and Plastics SA to develop an action plan to strengthen the capacity of local industry to manufacture alternative materials and build up capacities for plastic recycling. We believe that the knowledge products and the outcomes of both projects will help to inform and enable a better space for biomaterials in the country. So through this workshop, we really intend to disseminate the knowledge that we have gathered and listen to your thoughts and ideas on growing the biomaterials market in South Africa, I look forward to very interesting and fruitful discussions today. But before I go, I would like to quickly express our sincere appreciation to all our partners, Department for Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, the Department of Science and Innovation, and the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Not only for providing the valuable advice and direction on the knowledge products, but I would also like to thank Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies for leading the development of this study on behalf of DEFF and UNIDO and for organizing the workshop today. I encourage everyone to actively take part in the deliberations to enable us come up with final product and recommendations that will serve the growth of the bioeconomy in South Africa. Thank you very much and welcome to everyone.
Thank you very much, Uznimi. Mohamed Lerato, are you ready to upload your slides?
Okay, great. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And as mentioned in the introduction, this study is part of a broader initiative to really move forward the development of the biomaterials markets in South Africa. The study comes as part of a phase of looking at two kind of often neglected parts in the biomaterials development and research space. So traditionally, when we talk about biomaterials, there's a lot of efforts and research being devoted to developing the supply side, increasing supply capacity, research and development, bridge financing to make processes and production commercialized. However, we have to keep in mind that a market has two sides, and there's a consumer side as well. So this study looks at the demand side and the potential for policy levers to increase demand and grow markets from that end. Also, traditionally with biomaterials, there's been a lot of focus on biofuels and biofuels development, but increasingly, plastics are an important consideration that we need to take into account. And it's a product that comes from the petrochemical complex, a value chain that's traditionally hard to decarbonize. So the idea with this study and analysis is to try and break new ground, is to look at the demand side and to look at the demand side of bioplastics in particular. The idea behind the research was to undertake an analysis of the precedent in different countries and how they've thought about incentivizing demand for bioplastics, as well as understanding the local South African context and undertaking some market investigation to understand who the suppliers are of bioplastics and who the consumers are, and what are the dynamics around this, this relationship. So to start off, I'd just like to underscore the importance of plastics in our modern lives. And the next three slides, I just show some graphics that indicate what the data tells us. So in the first slide, we compare the growth of production in plastics to other bulk commodities. And what we can see is since the early 1980s, plastic production growth has far outstripped the growth in other types of bulk commodities. And here we contrast it to commodities like cement, aluminum, and steel. And we can clearly see that the growth, particularly since the 2000s, has been quite dramatically higher than the growth in other bulk commodities. In the last 20 years or so, that growth has principally come from, emerging developing economies like China, India. When we look at the global plastics production, there are a large number of different polymers that can be produced that count as plastics, but there are really a handful of polymers that account for majority of production volumes. And three polymers specifically, so polyethylene, polypropylene, and PVC, account for roughly 70% of the production volumes in, say, in the last 5 years or so. And when we look at what these polymers are used for, predominantly the single largest group of use is for packaging applications. And that picture is similar in South Africa as well. So packaging and building and construction at the global level account for approximately 61% of demand for plastics. In South Africa, based on data from Plastics SA, packaging accounts for 49% of our plastic demand. And this is from Plastics SA as well. And it's really an important industry to our economy. It provides, sustenance to around 1,800 companies in the economy, mainly small and medium-sized enterprises. Roughly 60,000 people are employed in the industry. So it's an important industry, and it's not an industry that we can just get rid of overnight, because plastics, provide a number of end consumer goods, as well as provide vital inputs into industry. So when we want to think about planning a future sustainable course for this industry, we want to look at how we can substitute with more sustainable plastics. And what we're advocating here is for bioplastics. So on the current slide, we show, and it's just a point there, again, there's a huge number and quite a diverse variety of bio-based polymers, but here we show some of the main ones. And we want to get a few points across here. So one is that there's quite a diversity in bio-based polymers. There's a wide variety of uses that they can be used for, and they also differ in their characteristics. So just because plastic is bio-based, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's biodegradable. And conversely, just because a plastic is based on a fossil fuel input, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's not biodegradable. So here we show some of the main bioplastics. So there's starch-based polymers, which currently account for the largest proportion of globally produced bioplastics, and they're used in packaging and other types of applications. Then the second two we have are PHA and PLA. And these two polymers are regarded as really potential future growth areas in bioplastics, because they have quite a diverse application and use. Particularly, they can be used in packaging, where demand is set to rise in some of the economies I mentioned earlier, so like India, China, and Brazil. So PLA and the PHA group of polymers stand to be future growth areas in the medium to long term. And then there are a number of other polymers that can be produced from bio-based roots. Polyethylene and PVC, which are some of the main polymers that are demanded at the moment, can also be produced from bio-based roots. It's interesting to note that these are not biodegradable. And there are certain applications where biodegradability is not a characteristic that we want. So for example, if we want bioplastics to substitute for infrastructure like municipal piping and roofing, there we want a plastic that's not going to degrade. So we want a bio-based substitute that's not biodegradable. And these bio-based polymers can provide uses there as well. Yeah, this slide just is taken from the previous report that examined the supply side dynamics of biomaterials. And here we see as well, in the top left quadrant, we have bio-based polymers that are not biodegradable, like polyethylene and polypropylene that I just mentioned. Then we also have bio-based polymers that are biodegradable, like the PHA group and PLA. So it's important to look at the global trends for bioplastics markets to understand the context in which we are operating. And on this slide, we have data from the European Bioplastics Industry Association. And on the left-hand side, in the short to medium term, there's growth anticipated in these markets. On the right-hand side, we see that as of 2019, bioplastics volumes were around 2.1 million tons globally. It's important to acknowledge that this is a very, very small proportion of the overall plastics market. It's about 1% of overall production volumes. This overall market is set to grow to approximately 2.4 million tons by 2024. Currently, starch blends, as I indicated earlier, account for a substantial proportion. PHA and PLA are set to grow substantially in the future. PHA is anticipated to grow approximately 6 times by 2024, and PLA is anticipated to grow by roughly 8 to 10% by over the same time period. In South Africa, just as in the global picture, the penetration of bioplastics is still low. There's still some way, as we see with these emerging sustainable markets, for the technology to reach cost parity with the traditional fossil-based polymers that are produced. There's a handful of firms that are involved in the production on the supply side. So there's some firms that started off as research ideas. So for example, Optimus Bio is a firm that produces biochemicals from indigenous bacteria. That was originally started as a research effort within the CSIR. However, there are private firms as well, like Polyoak, for example, that creates the green bottle for Woolworths that it launched in 2016 that has 30% bio-based polymer in it. There's also quite a lot of research capacity that's been devoted to developing on the supply side. The figure shows the trade balance for some of the major polymers, and what we see is that we have a trade surplus in some polymers like propylene. However, there's a trade deficit and a shortage in other types of polymers like ethylene. So there's room for bioplastics to potentially play a role in meeting the polymers where we have a trade deficit. So as part of the study and as part of the market investigation, we formulated a view on where the likely demand drivers are going to be for bioplastics in the short to medium term. The current demand for bioplastics is small. However, we see 3 principal demand drivers for bioplastics moving forward. The first source is where we have large multinational organizations where the head offices sit outside of South Africa, and there's increasing pressure after Paris 2015 and legislation that's changing throughout the world for private firms to really place sustainability at the center of their strategies. So we're seeing large multinationals like Coca-Cola and Unilever face pressure from their head offices in increasing the bio-based content in their production. So Unilever, for example, is quite involved in exploring bioplastics. It's part of their 2015 to 2020 strategy to incorporate bioplastics and investigate potential suppliers that can augment their production processes. The second driver is domestic firms, so firms like Woolworths and Growth Point that seek to involve sustainability in their strategies. So we know Woolworths has the green bottle, which is 30% plant-based plastics, and that's sourced from Polyoak that imports that bio-based polymer from Braskem, which is sugarcane derived. It's a polymer derived from sugarcane in Brazil. Growth Point has sustainability criteria and their green building standards. And they also incorporate sustainability elements and bioplastics into their businesses. In the very short to medium term, the demand is mainly by producers for drop-in plastics. So these are plastics that can be easily substituted away from fossil-based inputs towards bio-based inputs. So there's not a substantial transition that needs to happen in the production process to incorporate these bio-based elements. Additionally, there's a number of encouraging collaborative initiatives. So in 2019, there was a South African initiative to end plastic pollution in the environment. This is really a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together PROs, retailers, state institutions. And encouragingly, there's a designated work stream that's devoted to the development of bioplastics in South Africa. So the awareness around these initiatives and the links to industry and state organizations can really help propel demand for bioplastics through that. There's also the SA Plastics Pact, which aims to lead innovation, dialogue, and collaboration in the industry. And this is also another opportunity to increase demand for bioplastics, given the linkages between important stakeholders in the economy. Just to complete the picture, although this is not the core focus of the study, is to look at the supply side dynamics as well. And supply is currently small. The encouraging signs by private sector suppliers, and this like Sapi Biotech, Safripol, Lignotech, Optimus Bio, Polyoak. These are all firms that are involved in the space, and these are firms that are involved in the space and are involved in ramping up supply domestically. From the R&D side, there's a number of research efforts that are being driven by CSIR and a number of other university initiatives, with lots of funding being mobilized by DSI. In the previous study, there were a number of barriers that were identified on the supply side that included the innovation environment, the extent to which pilots are being supported, the extent to which bridge financing helps to commercialize some of these technologies, as well as feedstock and access to feedstock issues, the extent to which feedstock can be traded across border in addition, as well as the competitiveness of the technology with the traditional incumbent fossil polymer production. So some of the interventions that were identified in that study were the need to match feedstock, the need for bridge funding, as I mentioned, support for pilots, and a number of other recommendations. So once we're done with the session, we will make the PowerPoint available, and at the bottom right-hand side is a link to that full report, should anyone want to explore those issues in more detail. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Lerato, who will take us through some of the demand stimulus policy measures that we identified from examining the policy precedent. And after she is done with that, I will end off the session with the relevance and application for South Africa and some of the dynamics around that. So Lerato, you can take over.
Thank you, Mohammed. Based on the literature, we identified 5 policy options intended to stimulate demand for bioplastics. These are bans, taxes, social awareness, standards and labels, and green procurement. These policy measures are not mutually exclusive and are typically implemented in some combination. Next, please. So the first policy option is bans, and bans consist of restrictions or prohibitions of a type, specification, or combination of plastics and other polymers. They apply to the manufacture, sale, retail distribution, and import of plastics, and serve to increase the demand for bioplastics as consumers have to switch to alternative products. There's considerable variation in how plastic bans can be instituted. They can have a geographical scope, meaning they can be implemented at the national or regional or local level. There are bans based on physical properties such as size or thickness. There are full bans and partial bans. A full ban is a ban on all single-use plastics, and a partial ban would be a ban on specific products such as straws or plastic bags. There are retail distribution bans, which is a ban on free retail distribution. A full retail ban would apply to all retail distributors, while a partial ban would apply to a particular market segment. And lastly, there are production limits, which prevent or limit the market entry of plastics. So the effectiveness of plastic bans depends on the type of ban implemented. Full bans and production limits yield the strongest socioeconomic and environmental impact, as they directly prevent or substantially limit the market entry of plastics. Partial bans have a relatively weaker socioeconomic and environmental impact, as more plastic can enter the market. And lastly, retail distribution bans have the weakest socioeconomic and environmental impact, as they allow plastics to enter through other distribution points. So various countries have different approaches to how they implement their ban. An example of a strong approach is Rwanda's ban. Rwanda instituted a nationwide ban on all non-biodegradable plastics. It was enforced with strict penalties and involved extensive stakeholder consultation. The ban was also introduced with the tax incentives for recycling equipment and the manufacturing of environmentally friendly bags. An approach that is strong to moderate is Kenya's ban. Kenya's ban was on thin plastic bags. It was also enforced with strict penalties. However, plastic bag use is still common in slums and in rural areas. And lastly, Bangladesh's approach is moderate to weak. The ban was on plastic bags. Initially, the ban received a positive response. However, due to a lack of enforcement, plastic bag use continued. In 2010, Bangladesh introduced stricter penalties. However, due to a lack of thorough enforcement, plastic bags continued to be used. The next policy option is taxes. Taxes or levies are charges on consumers and businesses on the sale, import, or production of conventional plastics. Taxes increase demand for bioplastics as they increase the cost of consumption of conventional plastics, incentivizing consumers to switch to alternatives. There's variations in how taxes are implemented. Taxes can be implemented at the producer level, directly to consumers, or at the wholesale level, where retailers incur the cost and then have the flexibility to pass the cost on to final consumers. There are judicial level taxes, and there are taxes that vary based on the product characteristics. Next, Mohammed. So taxes are primarily instituted to change behavior, and they are as effective as their price, which needs to be high enough to change behavior. Taxes on both manufacturing and consumers yield the strongest environmental and socioeconomic impact, as they deter both consumption and manufacturing of plastics. And taxes levied on manufacturing are effective when the tax can be transferred to the end users. Next. So again, country approaches to taxes vary. Ireland's tax is an example of effective policy design and implementation. The tax was at point of sale of consumers, and prior to the implementation of the tax, Ireland underwent extensive stakeholder consultation on the implementation and design of the tax. Surveys were conducted to determine consumers' willingness to pay for the tax, and the tax rate set was 6 times higher than the willingness to pay of consumers. The Welsh tax is also an example of a moderate to strong approach. The Welsh tax was on single-use carrier bags. Prior to the tax, the Welsh had a voluntary campaign called Bags for Life with supermarkets, which promoted reusable bags. The low cost of Bags for Life led to consumers using reusable bags as throwaway bags, which had considerable environmental impact. And since 2011, when the levy was introduced, the tax has not increased. And a 2019 study revealed that consumers welcomed the increase in the levy. Botswana's approach is considered moderate to weak. Botswana implemented a tax through retailers, where retailers could set the price of the tax. However, it did not have a revenue collection mechanism, and the tax revenue was not collected from retailers. As such, public support fell as consumers saw that the tax was not used for intended purposes. Next. So the next policy option is standards and labels. Standards and labels specify the product characteristics, indicating the sustainability and eco-friendly elements of the product. Standards and labels for bioproducts are classified under eco-labels. Eco-labels are a voluntary method of environmental performance certification and disclosure, which encourages sustainable consumption and promotes green markets. Eco-labels raise awareness for bio-based products, thus increasing their demand. Countries which have green public procurement policies have implemented these policies alongside eco-labeling. Eco-labeling simplifies public procurement processes, thus reducing the administrative cost of green public procurement. The ISO differentiates between 3 types of eco-labels. Type 1 is the strongest form of certification. It involves multiple criteria, is licensed by third party, and can involve the life cycle analysis of the product. Type 2 involves self-declarations based on sustainability criteria where the claims are verifiable and accurate. And type 3 involve quantitative indicators of environmental performance based on life cycle analysis comparisons for products which serve the same purposes. And within the ISO variations, there are a number of ways in which eco-labels can differ. Eco-labels can differ in their sectoral scope of coverage, meaning that they can differ for the various industries and sectors. They can differ in terms of their sustainability content, where some eco-labels focus on climate change or pollution sources. Eco-labels can vary on the type of assessment, meaning that some have a full life cycle analysis where others do not, and eco-labels can be mandatory or voluntary. Next. So the effectiveness of standards and labels largely depends on the public's familiarity and trust with the label. Thus, third-party certified, mandatory, externally monitored, and audited labels yield the strongest environmental and socio-economic impact. Countries have different approaches to standards and labels. China's approach is ambitious and growing. The environmental labeling program is voluntary, where labels are valid for 3 years and subject to review and renewal. China's success has been based on its regular updates to its labels and the expansions of products and product categories. China's green public procurement and its eco-label program has created strong incentives for manufacturers to design and create greener products. Thailand has had moderate success with some challenges. There is no formal legislation for eco-labels in Thailand. Their policy is implemented through the Environmental Management Plan. Thailand doesn't have a national footprint for eco-products, meaning that eco-products are not available throughout the country. And the voluntary nature of their green public procurement policy has meant that some state agencies have opted out of procuring products with eco-labels. Thanks. The next policy option is green public procurement. Green public procurement involves the procurement of green products by the state. And given the size of the state, green public procurement can increase the demand for bio-based products and stimulate those markets. Green public procurement, as mentioned before, is typically implemented with environmental policies such as eco-labeling. There's variations in how green public procurement can be implemented. Green public procurement can be implemented at the national, local, sub-national, or it can be targeted at state-owned institutions. Green public procurement can be mandatory or voluntary. It can include a wide range of products or a narrow range of products. It can target specific sections of the value chain, such as with plastics, where a green public procurement criteria would require the use of reusable or recycled plastics. And there are green public procurement criterias which have synergies with other social and political considerations, which take into consideration the environmental inclusivity and sustainability requirements of various organs of state. Next. The effectiveness of green public procurement is dependent on a comprehensive standards and labeling framework. Green public procurement, which includes a wide range of products, is mandatory and monitored annually, yields the strongest environmental and social impact, whereas a voluntary green public procurement with a narrow product base would yield the weakest socioeconomic and environmental impact. South Korea and Japan are the leaders in Asia in green public procurement. South Korea's Act on Promotion of Procurement for Eco-Friendly Good is a voluntary plan where state agencies set voluntary targets and report their performance to the Ministry of Environment. South Korea has a green product information system, an online platform which assists in reporting and monitoring of green public procurement. Japan's Act on Procurement of Eco-Friendly Goods and Services is mandatory for all state agencies. Japan uses NGOs and MPOs to assist government entities in promoting green public procurement. Thailand's approach is ambitious, but it is lacking in government. The green procurement in Thailand is voluntary and decentralized. The lack of an eco-label footprint means that implementing agencies are responsible for their own tracking systems, and training and awareness has not been uniformly applied across implementing agencies, meaning that some implementing agencies do not have the technical knowledge to make those sustainable purchases. Next. The last policy option is social awareness. Social awareness involves the persuasion, education of the general public regarding the sustainability of bio-based products, thus increasing their demand. It can be initiated by the state or by private stakeholders and requires regular and engaging messaging through appropriate channels. There are various ways in which social awareness campaigns can be implemented. One, through traditional or online media, through rewards, awards, or other incentive programs, through being incorporated in education curriculum, promotional activities such as conferences and demonstrations, through social nudging, which involves positive reinforcement to consumers through small incentives, in-store messaging or signs, and through social proofing, which uses experts and influencers to promote and endorse bio-based products. Next. So an effective social awareness campaign is one which is informative, targeted, consistent, involves multiple stakeholders, and uses multiple channels. It's important, though, that social awareness campaign considers the differences in demographics and inequity, as messaging can be received differently by different people. And lastly, the approaches to social awareness. Here we have an example of a Go Green campaign by Malaysia. Malaysia implemented the Go Green campaign in partnership with NGOs to encourage green behavior and sustainable consumption. Their campaigns included No Plastic Days and the 3 Rs. And a study on the impact of these campaigns revealed that behavioral change was higher or most likely for females, families with young children, individuals who earned higher incomes, and people who resided in urban residences. Japan's campaign, its Fun to Share campaign, was a nationwide campaign to fight climate change through promoting the share economy. Initially, their campaign had little interest between people between ages of 18 and 26. And as such, Japan has taken new efforts to increase the attention of young people through incorporating pop stars and influencers in their campaign. Thank you, Mohammed. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rato, for for running through the policy experience and some of the learnings and experiences in other countries. So in this kind of latter part of the presentation, we want to look at the insights for South Africa from given this policy review and look at some of the dynamics in the South African marketplace. And we'll go through these different policy options in turn. So first, when we look at bans and taxes, we know that South Africa, currently has the minimum gauge of 30 microns. So below 30 microns, plastic bags are not allowed to be produced or illegal to be produced. And there's a levy on the manufacturing of thicker bags, and that levy goes to SARS and then eventually finds its way to the National Revenue Fund, where the state can appropriate it in whatever way it sees fit. And this has kind of been a bone of contention in the plastics industry and in plastics discussions generally since the policy was instituted. There is a policy precedent in other countries where these funds can be ring-fenced and used within the plastics industry for development. So, increasing recycling initiatives, the development of newer markets like bioplastics. So there is the debate around the ring fencing of those funds and the extent to which that can help develop markets like bioplastics. When it comes to the levy, there's some important points to bear in mind in South Africa. So should we wish to use the levy as a mechanism to increase substitution towards alternatives, there are a few things. So one question is, what rate do we set the levy at? Now, as Lerato mentioned, in some countries where they've had success with the levy in reducing traditional fossil-based plastic consumption, there have been some key things. And one of them has been an accurate determination of what this levy is. And in countries like Ireland and Portugal, the rate of the levy or the level of the levy was determined through quite a rigorous process. So there was, a representative survey of consumers that was done, and a determination of a demand profile that indicates what consumers are willing to pay for these plastic bags. And in those countries, they set the levy sufficiently higher than the willingness to pay, such that it could act as a concrete determinant. Now, there have been studies of the plastic levy in South Africa and the extent to which it's changed behavior. And the insights from some of those studies kind of give us an indication of consumer behavior in South Africa. And what they found in some of these studies is that immediately after the introduction of a levy or ramping it up, you see a decline in plastic consumption. However, that tends to be quite short-lived. Consumers soon get used to the levy and incorporate it into their costs, since it's quite nominal in relation to the overall spend at a retailer. So there's this almost this absorption of the cost with a lack of change in behavior. The other thing that's come through from the research is that consumers tend to find reusing bags inconvenient. So they'd much rather pay the nominal fee at a retailer than to reuse the bag. So we need to bear in mind some of these dynamics when we think about using the levy and how to determine the rate of the levy. At the moment, it's not clear the exact methodology that's used to determine the levy in South Africa and whether a survey is used or not. But it's something to bear in mind when we think about determining the levy if we want consumers to switch to other alternatives. Some of the learnings we can bring in also for South Africa is consultation. So there is a lot of consultation that goes on. However, it's important that consultation happens not only in policy design, but also in the policy implementation process. And in the countries where it's worked, there's been a lot of effort by the state to secure buy-in from consumers, from retailers, because what that does is that it gets people to agree on the levy, and it also gets people to inculcate that culture of reducing plastic consumption. Another important policy learning from this review was effective enforcement. And here, an interesting contrast, we can see an interesting contrast in the experiences of Rwanda and Bangladesh. So in Rwanda and Bangladesh, punitive policies were introduced for plastic consumption, traditional plastic consumption. However, the enforcement in these countries differed. So in Rwanda, they took quite a strict approach where law enforcement was present in markets. They do inspections and make sure that there was no plastic use or use of banned plastics. There was even thorough enforcement at the borders to prevent imported illegal plastics from coming into the country. Now, if we contrast that with Bangladesh, even though there were penalties and there were bans introduced, there was a clear lack of enforcement. The result was that we saw this creation of black markets for imported plastic bags, and the problems that plastic bags were resulting in, like litter, were not dealt with appropriately. So litter continued to be a problem in certain areas of the country in that case. So these are some important points we need to take into account when we think about the bans and the levies. We know that DEF is currently reviewing the plastic regulations with the potential extension to banning single-use plastics. So these lessons need to be borne in mind when we think about developing a policy around that. Now, when we talk about bans and levies, to make this work, there's a number of things to think about. So when we ban more plastics or increase the levies, this will result in costs to certain groups in the economy. So DEF will need to invest resources, particularly if you want to accurately determine the appropriate level of the levy. DEF will have to invest resources into assessing the bans and the levies and the demand profile of consumers. This could be DEF or this could be National Treasury. Treasury, if the levies are diverting consumption away to either heavier bags or bio-based bags, stands to face reduced levies in the future from traditional fossil-based plastic consumption. Producers as well will face impacts to the extent that they're unable to transition to incorporating bio-based plastics through supplementation or drop-in plastics or complete bioplastics production. If they're unable to make that transition, then they will face reduced demand and employment, particularly amongst vulnerable producers in the economy, small to medium-sized producers. There are obviously benefits that will accrue from a shift towards increased demand for bioplastics. There's a reduced impact on the environment. The plastics industry has a new capability and with the potential for export in the region. Retailers also have new sustainable options that they can use. The policy has risks. So, again, if there's poor enforcement of banned plastics or the levies, then the policy will fail. It also depends on consumers and how they behave. So it's very important that these types of policies have a key social awareness element in educating and creating awareness amongst all stakeholders, including consumers. From an implementation point of view, DEF or whichever mandated authority this sits with will have to undertake key stakeholder engagement and analysis of the appropriate level of the levy based on a representative sample of consumers in the economy. There's the potential for supply side incentives to assist producers to transition towards more sustainable production, and this certainly is the case in other countries. For example, in Rwanda, when they banned certain plastics, capital grants were provided to producers to assist them to transition. In that case and in that point of time, bioplastics weren't widely available, so they transitioned towards producing paper bags. But that cohesive policy in allowing producers to transition and assisting them is something that will also be required when we look at this particular policy. When we look at standards and labels, there are a number of eco-labels that are present in the country, predominantly international eco-labels, although there are some South African eco-labels as well. For example, the eco-product label is one that's in the building sector. That's a local eco-label. Currently, eco-labels occur on a voluntary basis in South Africa, and it can work as a mechanism to really change consumption behavior. But it's important here again that consumers are aware of what eco-labels mean and what it's saying about the product. There's some research in South Africa that indicates that consumers are able to identify certain labels, but a lot of them, consumers don't understand what they mean or what they say about the product. So there's certainly a need for awareness creating around the utility of eco-labels and what they mean. There's certainly a gap in South Africa. Also, there's synergies with an eco-label policy and other types of policies that one can use to increase demand for bioplastics. So another policy that I'm going to get to next, which is green public procurement. A lot of countries that have had success with green public procurement have actually preceded that policy with the development of an eco-label policy, because an eco-label in the context of GPP or green public procurement can really ease the transactions that procurement managers need to make, because it reduces the search costs and provides a credible indicator of the sustainability of the product. So at the moment, countries that have got this eco-label system and framework correct have developed a data framework with usually an entity like the Ministry of Environment, or in our context, DEF, that really develops this framework and monitors it. So there is room for DEF to play that role in formulating an eco-label framework, monitoring the extent to which labels are present in the economy, creating awareness around what the labels are and what they mean for consumers, as well as connecting with other countries. And this has been done in the cases of Thailand and Japan, where they network with other jurisdictions and try to understand how these jurisdictions think about eco-labels and what the best practice is. So there's certainly room for that in our context. When we think about eco-labels, this will require investment within the state and increasing of resources towards developing this framework. Producers will also need to engage with these labels to the extent that they want to incorporate them on their products as well. A point that comes through from the research in other countries is that in the case of getting your product labeled, this process can be accompanied by substantial consultancy costs and costs of accreditation. So that needs to be borne in mind when we think about particularly vulnerable producers, small, medium-sized producers that need to get those eco-labels. So when we're designing policy, we need to account for this dynamic as well. The benefits are obviously overall in the economy, you see a shift in consumption towards sustainable consumption. That depends on the extent to which the sustainable or these labeled products are price competitive with other competing products. From a risk point of view, if the products are not cost competitive, or if there's no substantial change in consumer behavior, excuse me, then there are opportunity costs to that. So again, I'm reiterating the point because it comes through quite clear in the literature. There has to be awareness raising to change behavior. From an implementation point of view, DEF or the appropriate authority needs to be provided with a mandate to develop this framework, and producers will need to engage with these different types of labels and absorb them into their products for it to be a success. Then when it comes to green public procurement, there's no national scale green public procurement in South Africa. There's some municipalities that are quite progressive. So in 2002, at the World Conference on Sustainable Development, a number of municipalities pledged to incorporate green procurement practices in their procurement. So far, the city of Cape Town, eThekwini, and Nelson Mandela Bay have been quite proactive, and they have elements of green procurement already in their procurement strategies. When we look at the learnings from other countries, the countries that have got this right have done a few things. Have had a few things in a few common features in getting this right. Firstly, it's the mainstreaming of green public procurement really at the national level. So central government takes on the role and then, indicates to different ministries that in their procurement, they need to undertake this at different levels of government. Usually it starts from central government and it's made mandatory in central government, like in the cases of Japan and South Korea, with the voluntary procurement at the local and provincial levels. Another success factor where it's worked is where you have centralized platforms, and the idea here is you want to reduce the search costs for procurement managers. So you create these centralized platforms where procurement managers can be linked with accredited suppliers of these sustainable goods and services, such that it's easily accessible for procurement managers. Another point which is not on the slide, but which is also important, is monitoring and tracking. In Japan, for example, each ministry annually will submit to the central industry, usually the Ministry of Environment, on which product categories it's procured sustainable goods in, and the number of goods it's procured in those categories. So that's another important point to bear in mind. So when we're talking about a national scale GPP, obviously this does increase costs of procurement in that now there's more training and upskilling that's required for procurement managers. Producers also, based on the sustainability criteria, which will be published by the state, will have to adjust their production to align with the needs of the state around sustainability. The benefits are that the state takes the lead role in creating demand for sustainable goods and services, and bioplastics in particular in this case. I mean, an interesting example in the case of Japan was that, they set the criteria at each level for each product. So they started off small with ballpoint pens in the early 2000s. So Japan set the criteria so I've got a pen here in my hand. If you look, there's the housing of the pen, for example. They set the criteria that the housing should be 40% recycled or bioplastic. The ink cartridge should be refillable. The housing that the pen comes in should have minimum content of recycled or bioplastics. And in that way, producers responded to those production criteria by altering their production. The result was that between the early 2000s and say 2013, so about 10 to 13 years, there was a doubling in the market size for green pens. So those pens specifically produced for the state. So in that way, in that case, the state acted as a key consumer and grew that market for that sustainable good, which other consumers in the economy could then purchase given the market size and the scale that that particular market reached. So the state can play a clear role in the case of GPP in growing the market from the demand side. There are risks when we look at such a policy. So it may be the case that there's just no domestic suppliers of that good or service. So then one needs to examine the incentives that need to be provided or the room for industrial policy measures to actually support sustainable production along the GPP framework. There's also the risk that domestic producers are unable to switch should the criteria be prohibitive, or should the type of production be too costly, then the risk is that domestic producers can't meet the criteria as set out by the GBP framework. From an implementation point of view, you know, the relevant departments like Treasury, DEF, and DTIC should work together to develop this framework such that all the elements are taken into account: the environmental, the trade and industrial, and the fiscal factors. An important part here is that, as I mentioned earlier, in other countries, they've had the ecolabel framework developed before GPP because it can reduce the search costs and it can make procurement much easier, especially when you want to scale it to provincial and local levels. And finally, we end off with social awareness. And here in South Africa, there's quite a lot of awareness that's created, and they come from different areas of the economy. So they come from the production side, from producers of plastics, from PROs like Plastics SA, Petco, DEF as well. However, direct messaging on bioplastics is still lacking, given the novelty and newness of this industry. There has been criticisms leveled against South Africa, and particularly around plastics, in the sense that there's a need for more collaborative messaging, so combined messaging. And the new initiatives around the Initiative to End Plastics and the Plastics Pact really provide optimism that this awareness is going to be ramped up substantially, specifically in the case of bioplastics, given that bioplastics feature heavily in these collaborations. It's important, however, from the literature that the messaging needs to be designed in a certain fashion, or important things need to be taken into account. So it's clear that ad hoc messaging, once-off messaging, is not enough, and the messaging needs to be consistent. So it needs to happen frequently over time. Another important element is that the awareness needs to be targeted. So, you know, it needs to be tailored to the population in terms of various different types of disaggregation. So yeah, it needs to be tailored according to income level. It needs to be tailored according to the type of family, according to whether it's urban or rural, because people in these different types of environments accept and interpret information in different ways. So it's important that these awareness campaigns be delineated for these different groups in the economy. So here again, you know, to increase awareness, there needs to be resources mobilized within the state to ensure this targeted and consistent messaging that's tailored to different groups. There's also room within the education policy to incorporate greater knowledge and education around climate change, around plastics use, and the impact of plastics on the economy and on the environment. There is some literature around this where you know, researchers have gone into schools and questioned learners, questioned teachers, try to understand the extent to which you know, climate education is a big part of South African education policy. And to date, there are gaps that need to be filled in that. Anyway, this is what the evidence indicates. The benefits of this is that we should see reduced plastic consumption and you know, an increased demand for alternatives like bioplastics, and the potential for consumers and newer generations to be more greatly educated as to how to make sustainable decisions in their consumption. There are risks, you know, obviously we live in a world of finite resources, so there's potential opportunity costs in the state for other types of imperatives. There's also, from the plastic producer side as well, there are also opportunity costs there as well. From an implementation point of view, one of the ministries, potentially DEF, needs to engage in targeted and frequent messaging. That's not to say that that does not happen. There are quite a number of initiatives that DEF is involved in, but this needs to happen on a larger scale and on a more frequent way. There's a potential for DBE to incorporate more climate education into the syllabus and to make it a more prominent part both in primary and secondary education. And there's also, from the implementation side, for producers to increase their efforts around this. I mean, at the end of 2020, we saw the new extended, the EPR, the extended producer responsibility. And I saw in the question, someone asked about that as well. So here also, I mean, it's really an opportunity with these new regulations for producers to take ownership of where their products eventually end and, post-consumption, what happens. So, on the way forward, we've, in the study, looked at the policy precedents in a number of countries. We've applied it to the South African context and provided some insights. But ultimately, when we look at these different policies, it has to occur in a holistic fashion. There's no silver bullet. Bioplastics is not going to be the silver bullet. It's part of a overall process towards moving our economy to more sustainable production in a world where there's increasing pressures to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So it's going to take up a basket of policy responses to increase demand for bioplastics. And it's important for some of these initiatives to bear in mind how the various collaborative the various collaborations will impact the demand for bioplastics moving forward. So thank you for your time today. And yeah, we can move into the next part of our workshop.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thanks to Lerato as well. As you're saying, Mohammed, you are presenting, quite a structured piece of work, which aims to really just map out some of the options available, the policy options that exist in different contexts or case studies, as you guys selected specific case studies. And then drawing from that, you're saying, okay, what is viable in South Africa or even feasible, using, I would say, an initial say-us. And as we move on to this section of the program, I would say that many of the questions are actually asking us to expand how we approach the say-us, if that makes sense. So I'm going to tackle them in a group. So I'm going to do a few, I'm going to do maybe one or two at a time, because many of them conceptually are combining many things. But I do want to say that Mohammed and Rato, you can respond to some of the Q&A questions, which are actually comments. But if not, we can always respond to these questions at a later stage. Obviously, we're going to send out the slides as well as the research itself. So, you'll be able to assess who exactly has asked a particular question, and you can engage directly following this workshop. So in asking the first question, Tamina asks, what about promoting green entrepreneurship and circular economy as effective policy measures and systemic approaches to promoting the bioplastic sector and its value chain? And obviously she's alluding to other impacts leading to creating new jobs through fiscal policy incentives. I'm going to leave it at that. Mohammed, you're unmuted, so I'm going to allow you to perhaps respond to Tamina's question.
Yeah, no, so that's, there's certainly scope within, and there's a number of there's a number of initiatives that seek to increase green entrepreneurship in the economy. And yeah, bioplastics is not the only sustainable product that can be produced. So there certainly is room for greater support, not only from business incubators and firms that seek to help entrepreneurs bridge that gap between the development of their product and commercialization, but there's also room for industrial policy measures to support certain vulnerable groups in the economy. So there's certainly, yeah, I do agree with that. There is an urgent need for more support to be levied to green entrepreneurship in the country.
And then just leading on from that, in terms of how you in the paper perhaps could think through extending your SAYAS, Reynard asks, how does the price of bioplastics compare to virgin plastic or plastic with a high recycled content?
Yeah, so currently it would depend. So if it's the case of a drop-in plastic, where you're just replacing the fossil-derived plastic with chemically identical bio-based plastic, it's more cost competitive for firms to incorporate. They don't have to incur a substantial price rise as compared to if the production process is completely bioplastic. So if it's completely bioplastic, we're talking about at pilot scales, magnitudes of orders higher than the traditional coal-based polymer production in South Africa. So there is some way to go in bioplastics reaching price parity. If you're talking about complete 100% bioplastic production in South Africa. Yeah, so we're talking about the next, say, 5 to 10 years before we reach that point. It obviously depends on how the technology evolves and how some of the big international projects that are going on develop. So it's a bit uncertain at the moment, but yeah, there's still some way to go.
And to what extent does the paper think about the impacts on the recycling plastic industry? This is a question posed by Nathan. And specifically he says, if the percentage of bio-based material and plastic waste stream increases, has this assessment been done? I mean, it's not necessarily the complete focus of your paper, but perhaps Nathan's asking, is this considered in the SAYAS part of your analysis? Or
yeah, so as you mentioned, it's not the core focus, but there has been a risk identified in the sense that if you just completely, so it's important to bear in mind what's going to happen to the product post-consumption. And we have identified that some you do get bio-based plastics that are not biodegradable. So if they end up in the waste stream, it seems as if you're just substituting one problem with another. So in the design of the product, at the product design stage, it's important that manufacturers, and especially now when we have the new EPR regulations, take into account the extent to which, if they're using bio-based products, whether they're biodegradable or not. Because the last thing you want, which I think is the point that's being highlighted, is the last thing you want is to substitute one bad plastic with another bad plastic. So that doesn't, from a sustainability point of view, that's not desirable.
I'm not sure, Lerato, you can, whenever you feel, add to Mohammed's answers. Mohammed, Reynard, sorry to go back to Reynard. What about considering EPR policy and the role it could potentially play in stimulating demand for bioplastics?
Yeah, certainly. So with the EPR regulations released late last year, for which plastics is also included, the general idea is, is to hold manufacturers to greater accountability for what happens to their products post-consumption. So, so encouraging bioplastics within an EPR framework is certainly desirable because it increases the availability of bioplastics on the market. So it certainly, increases the supply of bioplastics. Then that can, that can assist. For example, if retailers want to increase sustainability in their procurement, they have options to do that with, and then that can filter into the market, for example. So the EPR has a role, has certainly a role to play in bioplastics development.
All right, thanks, Mohammed. I know some of our colleagues on have been involved in the plastics master plans. So this is not a question to that you have to answer perfectly, but having read the paper myself, question that I thought of that Lauren de Kock, where and in what way has this piece of work interfaced with the existing? I know it's at an advanced stage, but have you interfaced with the research work that was towards the development of the plastics master plan? I think she's really asking whether you've considered like a broader holistic picture, considering the lack of investment and capacity in end-of-life management.
Are you posing a question to me, or are you?
To what extent, so she's trying to figure out if the plastics master plan, if you've really interfaced with the plastics master plan when developing this, although narrow piece of work, has that been considered?
Yeah, so we obviously did pay attention. It's important to pay attention to the policy landscape. So as part of understanding the policy environment, we did, there were drafts of the plastic master plan that were made available. So we did review those to get a contextual understanding of where bioplastic fits in currently in the industry and the plans for the industry moving forward. So that certainly did, we did review the available versions of the master plan at the time.
All right. Hi, Mahlori, please, can you pose your question to the floor? You may unmute him.
Yeah, let me say, during the time of the Asmal, all right, there was intention to stop the use of plastics completely, and then we went to the paper bags. But in the long run, then those plastics were actually reintroduced back into the supermarkets, and then, but this time at a cost. But then presently, who is actually gaining from those the sale of those plastics at the supermarkets? And why was the paper plastics so far stopped? Why the paper bags were they stopped from the swap? Because to me, that was actually the most safe method of stopping the use of plastics in supermarkets. But now they are back there, and then we're being charged. But then where is that money going? Is it going to the kind of companies that are selling them, or is it part of the remedial action of addressing the plastic problem in South Africa? Thank you.
Thanks, Mahlori. So I don't know which specific instance, so where the paper bags were taken off. However, based on our research and engagements, our understanding is that there's a straight pass-through by retailers. So our understanding is that retailers don't make a profit on. To the extent that retailers keep plastic bags, because we're seeing a number of retailers like Woolworths, for example, that are removing plastic bags from their stores and encouraging consumers to reuse the cloth bags. But, to the extent where plastic bags are being sold, our understanding is that it's a straight pass through. So it's the firm just passing to the cost of them buying the bag and adding the levy on top of that. In terms of the levy itself, the levy goes to SARS, which then goes to the National Revenue Fund, and that's not ring fenced. So it goes into the fiscus and then it's used by the state as it sees fit.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. There's another question again suppose all of these questions are tackling the extent to which your SAS is comprehensive. It's from Jen's asking and acknowledging that it's a good piece of work. One is around the type, I think two further aspects could also be addressed to promote biomaterials. One is around the type of technology that needs to be used. Is this intermediate or high technology, and is it readily available in South Africa, or can it be produced in South Africa, thereby also creating subsidiary industries? Number two is around job losses in the traditional fossil-based plastic industry, and then future job creation projections in the biomaterial industry. So really provoking us to think about the potential job net job gains, and James is saying this would be important for the government to ensure that the transition to a low carbon economy is also job ready. I know this is one up your alley, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think those are good points. I mean, it wasn't entirely a supply side. It wasn't a supply side study at all. So we didn't do a thorough examination of, technology and capabilities and the extent to which the technology is intermediate or high tech. Possibly covered in the previous phase of the project, but an important determinant of what's available and what's needed to transition. So the point is taken. It's important to understand that, and it's crucial to understand the job impacts, because as a country given our unemployment rate and given the low growth situation we found ourselves in for the last years or so, we can't afford to lose more jobs. So a proper analysis of the extent to which jobs are going to be impacted from this transition would be useful. We haven't done that in this study particularly, but it's certainly an important determinant that should feed into a policy to shift production towards bioplastics.
Right, thank you. Nathan is just asking, what are the opportunities for exports of bioplastics such as PLA resin, given our significant regional endowment, sugar endowment?
Yeah, so the PLA is one of the major, is touted to be one of the major growth polymers in bioplastics, and packaging applications or packaging demand is set to take off principally in India, in China, and in Brazil. So there is substantial demand for that moving forward. So my view is that there is an export opportunity, but the exact endowment and how much of that can be processed and the supply capabilities is something that I don't know offhand. It wasn't a focal part of the study per se, but given the trends and the global demand and where that demand is anticipated to come from, it seems like there would be a regional opportunity.
And then I know in the paper you in some way allude to the ways in which South African policy commits to bioplastics, but I suppose Matt Spence is asking a political settlement question. Where do bioplastics sit in terms of priority in South African policy?
So my view as someone who's not a policymaker, I can't speak for policymakers. But given our understanding, it plays an important role in that it's, if we want to transition away from fossil-based plastics, it's one of the only potential routes that we have as a future product. So my view is that it should be high on the agenda, particularly given the fact that we always looking for opportunities to diversify our products and what we export. And increasingly in a global world, particularly in the EU and the US, where sustainable goods are in high demand, it's certainly a new capability for us as a country. So at the moment, I don't think there's certainly policies around the bioeconomy and developing the bioeconomy in South Africa. So within the context of that bioplastic set, it's important from a policy point of view. That's my view. It should be high on the agenda.
And then a question from Bruce. I think it touches on, and you may expand on a previous question, which is, what is the ecological footprint of bioplastics, particularly the inputs? Is it primarily waste? And if not, then are we not simply creating another environmental pressure? Production of bioplastic is not decoupled from endless production of plastics for profit.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's an important question, and it's a question that's been within the bioeconomy space for a while. So, we detail this a bit more in the report, but the development of bioplastics has been through different phases historically. So initially there was a lot of focus on adding value to waste that come from various different sources, from abattoirs, agricultural waste, food waste, etc. And along with that, there was also emphasis on growing specific crops in agriculture for bioplastics, so for these production processes. The problem with that was that now you need to devote resources to specifically growing crops for biomaterials production, and then that can compete with food crops. That can also compete with the resources for fertilizers and arable land, water resources. So increasingly, there's been a shift in biomaterials and bioplastics towards solutions that are less ecologically harmful. And the way that manifests is through the use of bacteria it's bacteria and water, sea-based organisms. And the idea there is to try and shift, or to try and relieve the resource intensity. So it's moving away from purpose-grown crops for biomaterials production towards using these bacteria that use less land, use less fertilizer and less resources, and are more climate compatible. So it may not be entirely ideal to purpose grow agriculture for biomaterials, but using some of these new solutions can help us make at least the feedstock more sustainable.
And then just your opinion, it's a comment from Emma saying, in her view, the main barrier of entry for compostable plastics is the lack of integrated waste management systems for compostable plastics. Any new application and use of these materials needs to be linked to systems for how to handle the waste. Retailers seemingly are not willing to risk investing in these materials until such systems are in place. In your opinion, it's not necessarily directly related to the work, but what's your opinion on that? So Emma's made a comment saying, in Emma's view, the main barrier of entry for compostable plastics is the lack of integrated waste management systems for plastics, of compostable plastics. Any new application and use of these materials need to be linked to systems for how to handle the waste. So I know you didn't necessarily thrash the full entire value chain dynamics out, but I mean.
Compostable, the waste management streams and the lack of combustible facilities wasn't a specific aim, but it has been identified as a barrier in South Africa, and that there's a lack of commercial combustible facilities. I think it's important here at the production stage also, and the EPR comes in is important here as well, is at the manufacturing stage, when these products are designed, they need to account for how they're going to be treated post-consumption. So when it comes to the compostability of bioplastics, there certainly should be design mechanisms or manufacturing practices to account for that. Yeah, that's the most I have to say about that. It is an important consideration and a barrier in waste management in South Africa.
All right, thank you. Do you see any hands? Could you assist me in that? I do encourage anyone wanting to pose a question live.
I see Gelo has joined us as well, so I'm sure he won't mind chipping in whenever he wants to.
I think Gelo's on leave. Let's let him rest.
I see another hand. Okay.
All right.
Rob.
Rob.
Hi, Rob.
Hi, thanks. So I just want to make the point, you've alluded to EPR a couple of times, but I think it's critical in this sector that there needs to be close cooperation between DEF and whether it's DTI or whoever's trying to grow the sector. And we've studied the wording of the draft Section 18 or of the Section 18 legislation quite carefully, and there are a lot of things in there that it's going to be impossible by the end of the year for the compostable or the bioplastics sector to meet, just because where traditional plastics have been around for quite a long time and there are existing PROs and there have been voluntary EPR schemes, none of that exists for compostables. And also, in many ways, while compostables have similar challenges to traditional plastics post-consumer from a separation and sorting perspective and logistics, getting them to processing facilities. From an actual processing perspective, where recyclable plastics have got some intrinsic value to recyclers, compostable materials don't. A commercial composter is not going to pay X rand a kilogram for bioplastics. So I think there needs to be really close engagement between the policymakers at DEF and the players in the sector to get, because at the moment biodegradables and compostables have just been tacked into the Section 18 legislation as if they were another plastic polymer, and the situation's a lot more complex than that. And I think there needs to be cognizance of the fact that, for instance, home compostable materials, if they're composted at home, no one's ever going to be able to account for those volumes. So where the requirements in the legislation say you as a producer need to be able to account for where all your material is going, if people are taking those home and putting them in the compost heaps at home, you can't account for that. So there needs to be some flexibility around the way the legislation is implemented. And I think there also needs to be clarity around what's going to happen if by the end of this year there isn't a PRO that deals with compostables, there isn't an approved EPR plan. What is government's response going to be around these materials? Are they going to be restricted from the time when the legislation comes in? So I think, yeah, I'd really like to. I think there are people from DEF on this call to put out a call for greater engagement, whether it's through the initiative that I'm part of or through COPCO, who are the Industry Association for Compostables, but just to, time's running short on this legislation, and we need to get to a workable solution.
Thanks, Rob. I suppose there's no, you may respond if you would like.
No, that's fine. No, I think that was valuable input.
I see a hand from Marilyn, but Marilyn's hand has now disappeared. So as we wait for that, Laura, I'm probably butchering your name, so apologies. Lorraine has made a comment. It would be interesting to see the environmental ranking of bioplastics versus fossil-derived plastics versus plastic with high levels of recycled content. Plastics, conventional bags with high recycled content perform better in numerous LCA studies, and even in a local LCSA study on plastics carrier bags recently done by the CSIR. It's obviously something to consider. And then Reynard asks, what about using seaweed-based feedstocks? They won't use agricultural land and could have co-benefits like providing habitat for fish species, providing an alternative income stream for small-scale fishers, etc. Just a thought. I suppose there's no way of tracking this one. It's an anonymous attendee. Notes that their understanding is that degradability occurs in varying degrees over various time periods under various conditions. So simply saying that something is degradable can be misleading as it depends on the conditions of the environment. Material has this been considered in the South African context? So I suppose that would just be, has this been considered as you articulate what you're advocating for in your paper?
So various, that happens at the design stage where there's flexibility in designing, the biodegradable characteristics of the product. And that certainly is something, that has to be borne in mind when you think about the end use of the product. So if you have a more long-term product, you want it to be composed of things that do not degrade, because it's going to act as a carbon sink and sit in sit underground or whatever the case is, on a roof. But if you're designing packaging or some sort of other consumer product that's going to degrade quickly, or be thrown into the bin and end up in a landfill, then you want it to you don't want it to sit and release carbon emissions slowly over time.
Thank you. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, ask Loreto the following question, or rather to comment on the following. So there's a comment about a particular area, I suppose you presented in today's session, giving us, those different policy options. So there's a point here that in the person's view, punitive measures at the point of transaction is not effective. The consumer needs to be caught way before the transaction to really address any change in consumer behavior. So what is your comment on that?
Yes, I agree with that point. And that is why policy measures such as social awareness, which educate consumers and draw consumers to the environmental impact of conventional plastics or conventional fossil fuel-based products, is important in order to make sure that those measures actually drive behavioral change.
All right. Thanks, Loreto. Mohammed, I'm just going to ask you maybe there are no hands up, and many of the Q&A box comments, I feel that you can address specifically. So can you maybe just take us through the way forward, just briefly, just 2 minutes, and then we can lead to closing the session.
Yeah, sure. So I guess as to in closing, so in the study we've tried to break new ground in the sense that we're looking at a market that hasn't been studied, very comprehensively in South Africa, and we'll be trying to make some headway in that around bioplastics, and specifically looking at the demand side, where a lot of resources tend to go on to the supply side. So we've gone through the different policy options, bans and taxes, social, ecolabels, GPP, as well as raising social awareness. And there's a number of learnings we can implement from different countries that have got it right. We want to avoid the so-called cookie cutter approach to policy making. We don't want to directly import policies from other countries, but we want to understand the rationale behind the policies and the context in which they occurred and adapt it to our local context. We have some of these measures already in place, like bans and taxes, although there's some room for them to be leveraged in increasing demand for bioplastics. And in other areas like ecolabels and GPP, there's more work to be done in establishing a comprehensive framework, particularly at the central government level. So encouragingly, there's a number of initiatives that are occurring in the South African space that's set to increase demand for bioplastics in the future. What will be required is a comprehensive solution of these various different policy measures, accounting for the resources that we have and the context in which we find ourselves. So look, there's I'm sure there probably a number of more questions that people have about the study and questions about things that we've said. So if we didn't get to your questions today, I'll put my email up on the screen, and please pop me an email, and yeah, we'd be happy to engage further and yeah, move the discussion forward.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thank you, Lerato, for your time, just providing really as far as possible within time constraints, a thorough review of what is in the paper. As Mohammed is saying, any questions, comments that are, geared towards this particular paper, Mohammed has put up his email address, and the actual presentation as well as the paper will be shared with those who've attended this session. From my side, thank you very much. It's been really fruitful engagement in the sense that it's extremely difficult to host any sort of stakeholder key informant engagement over Zoom. It's very strange, so thank you for bearing with us. There was a comment noting the static nature using Zoom, and we will definitely take that on board. For now, plugging TIPS's work, visit us at tips.org.za. But for now, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Bye, everyone.